This is the story of 14 million families. The farmer in Punjab who had worked the same land for 4 generations, and one morning woke up to find that land was now in a different country. The merchant in Lahore who locked his shop, picked up his children, and walked, and walked, and walked. The school teacher in Amritsar who watched her street, the street where she was born, where she got married, where she buried her parents, turn into a killing ground overnight. The fisherman in Bengal who had shared a boat, a meal, a life with his neighbor for decades, and then didn't. Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, neighbors, colleagues, friends, people who had coexisted for generations, suddenly, violently, irreversibly, on opposite sides of a line they had never seen. A line drawn in 36 days, by a British lawyer named Cyril Radcliffe, a man who had never set foot in India before that summer of 1947. A man who admitted, by his own words, that he had no knowledge of the subcontinent's geography, its languages, its communities, none of the generations of coexistence and conflict written into every village boundary, every irrigation canal, every sacred site. He was handed a map, he was handed a deadline, and in 5 weeks he divided a civilization of 400 million people. The result? The largest forced demographic displacement in recorded human history. 14 to 15 million people uprooted, somewhere between 200,000 and 2 million dead, 75,000 women raped or abducted, entire cities burned to ash. And the borders he drew, those 36-day borders, they are still there, today, right now. 2 of the most militarized, most volatile fault lines on Earth. 2 nuclear-armed states locked in a confrontation that has never truly ended. How does something like this happen? How does one man, in 1 month, with one pencil, break an entire continent, and condemn 3 generations to live in the wreckage? That is what we are here to find out. This is World Pivot. And if you want to understand the geopolitical fault lines that define our world today, subscribe right now, because this is exactly what we do. To understand the partition, you have to start with one fundamental geopolitical reality. By 1945, the British Raj was functionally over. Not because Britain chose to leave on its own terms, but because it could no longer afford to stay. World War II had bankrupted the empire. Britain's national debt had surpassed 250% of GDP. The manpower required to maintain colonial order across a subcontinent the size of Europe was no longer financially or politically sustainable. Prime Minister Clement Attlee's Labour government had a clear mandate: decolonize, and do it fast. Here is the first critical point. The hegemonic transition, the shift from British imperial control to independent governance, was not planned over decades. It was compressed into months. And in that compression, the empire's most dangerous legacy was activated: the ethno-religious fracture it had spent generations engineering. The British had governed India through a doctrine of divide and rule. Separate electoral rolls for Hindus and Muslims. Reserved seats along religious lines. Religion, systematically injected into the architecture of political power. The result, over decades, was the transformation of a diverse, multi-faith society into 2 competing blocs with irreconcilable claims to territorial sovereignty. On one side, Muhammad Ali Jinnah and the All India Muslim League. A lawyer, secular in his personal life, but now the architect of the 2-nation theory. The argument that Hindus and Muslims were not simply 2 religious communities, but 2 distinct nations, incapable of shared governance. On the other, the Indian National Congress, Nehru, Gandhi, committed to a unified, pluralist India, a single federal state, one nation, many faiths. These were not just political disagreements. They were fundamentally incompatible visions of territorial continuity, of who owns the land, who governs the people, and where the boundary between us and them is drawn. When Jinnah called for a direct action day in August 1946, the result was catastrophic. The Great Calcutta Killing. Thousands dead within days. The cycle of sectarian violence spread. Bengal, Bihar, Punjab. The subcontinent was already burning before a single border had been drawn. Mountbatten, arriving in March 1947 as the last viceroy, assessed the situation with the cold logic of a military commander. The differences were irreconcilable in the near term. Civil war was not a risk. It was already underway. A partition, he concluded, was not the ideal outcome. It was simply the only exit available. The question was no longer whether to divide. It was how. And that is where the catastrophe truly begins. This is where geopolitics meets its hardest limit, the gap between the logic of the map and the logic of the people. Cyril Radcliffe chaired the Boundary Commission with a mandate that was, on paper, straightforward. Divide Punjab and Bengal along lines that maximize the concentration of Muslims in Pakistan and Hindus and Sikhs in India. Maintain as much demographic cohesion as possible. Do it in 5 weeks. But here is the fundamental problem, and this is the cartographic failure at the heart of 1947. There were no clean lines. Punjab and Bengal were not divided between two distinct populations living in separate zones. They were intermixed, village by village, district by district. In some areas, a Muslim-majority bloc was surrounded by Hindu-majority towns. Sikh communities straddled what would become the border on both sides. Canal irrigation systems, the agricultural lifeblood of Punjab, crossed every conceivable boundary. Radcliffe had no detailed ethnographic data, no ground-level intelligence. He was working from 1941 census figures, already 6 years old, and from maps that could not capture the lived geography of 80 million people in Punjab alone. The commission itself was deadlocked. 4 members from the Congress Party, 4 from the Muslim League. No agreement was possible on virtually any contested district. So Radcliffe made the final determinations himself. The Radcliffe Line was, in many places, not a negotiated boundary. It was one man's judgment call, under extreme time pressure, in a country he did not know. The borders were not even published until August 17th, 2 days after independence had already been declared. For 48 hours, millions of people lived inside countries whose borders they could not see. When the lines were finally revealed, the consequences were immediate and violent. The Sikh community was, in the words of the historical record, effectively cut in half. Western Punjab's Sikh shrines, landed estates, sacred cities, handed to Pakistan. Nearly the entire Sikh population of Western Punjab fled east, and they didn't flee peacefully. The trains that carried refugees across the new border were ambushed. Columns of people on foot were massacred. This was not chaos at the margins. It was sectarian violence operating with organizational precision on both sides of the line. As soon as the new borders were announced, roughly 15 million Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs fled their homes. Some managed to board trains or buses, but most were forced to walk, joining refugee columns that stretched for miles across the Punjab plains. In the course of that exodus, as many as 2 million people were slaughtered. And then there is the fundamental geographic absurdity that defines Pakistan's original architecture. East and West Pakistan, 2 wings of a single nation, separated by over 1,000 miles of Indian territory. No territorial continuity, no strategic buffer. 2 populations sharing a religion, but almost nothing else. Different languages, different economies, different cultural identities. The partition had not created a coherent state. It had created a geopolitical paradox, a nation held together by ideology alone, with geography working actively against it. That paradox had a terminal date. In 1971, it collapsed. East Pakistan fought a war of independence. Bangladesh was born. The partition, in other words, was not a stable solution. It was a deferred crisis. The permanent legacy of 1947 is not measured in the casualties of that summer. It is measured in the strategic architecture locked into place, permanently. Kashmir is the epicenter, the geopolitical pivot on which the entire India-Pakistan relationship rotates. When British India was partitioned, the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir was given a choice. Its Hindu Maharaja, ruling a Muslim-majority population, initially sought independence. Then, facing an invasion by Pakistani irregular forces, he acceded to India in exchange for military assistance. Pakistan never accepted that accession. India never relinquished its claim. In 1974, India tested its first nuclear weapon. By 1998, Pakistan had matched it. Two nations born from the same colonial territory, now pointing nuclear arsenals at each other across a line drawn by a British lawyer in 5 weeks. This is not a historical footnote. In April 2025, a militant attack in Pahalgam killed 26 civilians, the deadliest attack on Indian soil since the Mumbai bombings of 2008. India launched Operation Sindoor in May 2025, striking 9 targets inside Pakistani territory. Both sides exchanged fire across the line of control every single day. The Indus Waters Treaty, suspended. The border crossing, closed. Bilateral relations at their lowest point in years. Every evening at the Wagah crossing, Indian and Pakistani soldiers lower their flags together in a synchronized ceremony of controlled tension. It has been performed since 1959. It is simultaneously a ritual of mutual recognition and a daily reminder that this border, this line, is not normal. It is the wound that never closed. Here is the cold geopolitical assessment. Was the partition inevitable? Probably yes. By 1947, the communal violence was already beyond the capacity of any power to contain. The two-nation theory had moved from political argument to lived reality, enforced by mobs and militias on both sides. A unified India, under those conditions, may well have produced a civil war of even greater scale. But was the partition executed with the competence and care that 400 million lives deserved? The evidence says no. A boundary drawn in 36 days by a man who had never been to India, with outdated census data, no ground-level geographic intelligence, and no mechanism for managing the population transfer that was the inevitable consequence. This was not diplomacy. This was an exit strategy dressed as a solution. The British Empire did not partition India because it had found a just answer to the Hindu-Muslim question. It partitioned India because it needed to leave, and partition was the fastest door available. The people of Punjab and Bengal, Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, paid the price for that urgency in blood. 14 million of them were displaced. 2 million may have died. And the strategic instability that exit created has now persisted for nearly 80 years, across 4 wars, 1 near-nuclear confrontation, and a continuous low-intensity conflict that shows no sign of resolution. 1 line on a map, 2 nuclear states in permanent confrontation, and hundreds of millions of people, across 3 generations, still living in the shadow of 5 weeks in 1947. This has been World Pivot. If this is the kind of geopolitical analysis you come here for, subscribe. There is more where this came from.